Last week, when we gathered to celebrate the Eucharist, we heard from the Gospel of St. Mark, where St. Mark relates to us a journey that Jesus was making with his disciples to Jerusalem. In fact, it would be the last journey that Jesus would make to the holy city. And in that Gospel of last week, we heard as Jesus and the disciples were walking along, Jesus asked them a question. Who do people say that I am? And the disciples came up with all sorts of answers. Some thought Jesus was John the Baptist come back to life. Others thought Jesus was Elijah, the great prophet of old. Still others, one of the other great prophets of ancient times. And then Jesus looked at the apostles and he said to them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter became the spokesperson for the group and he says, "You are the Christos. You are the Christ," meaning the Messiah, the anointed one of God. And then Jesus told them, "Don't tell anybody about this." Now, why would Jesus tell them to be silent, to be quiet, not to let people know that he was the Christos, the Messiah that they were longing and waiting for? It's because in the minds of Peter and the apostles and the people of that time, the Messiah that they were anticipating was a warrior Messiah, someone who would gather a vast army, arm them with weapons, and overthrow the oppressor of their land, whoever that oppressor might be. And at that time, it was the Romans. But Jesus knew he was not that kind of Christos. He was not that type of Messiah. And so he told them, the Son of Man will suffer much, be rejected by the chief priests and the elders of the people, be killed and raised on the third day. The disciples were shocked, overwhelmed. And Peter speaks out for the group by saying to Jesus, "God forbid if that should ever happen to you, not on my watch." And Jesus looked at him and said, "Get behind me, you Satan. You are thinking like men and not like God." Then he told them, "If you want to be part of my group, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me." In today's gospel reading from St. Mark, we continue the journey to Jerusalem. Although this time it's just Jesus and the 12 apostles. Jesus wanted to take some time, some quiet time to be with them, to continue and to instruct them on who he is and what he expects them to be. And so he tells them a little bit more about what's going to happen when he gets to Jerusalem. He says, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him." Jesus tells them he's going to be betrayed. One of his own will turn him in, will betray him to the chief priests and the scribes. The response, St. Mark tells us, they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to question him about it. And so they simply remained silent. They continued on the journey. Jesus a little bit ahead of them, they sort of holding back a bit, because although they didn't respond to what Jesus said, they were talking amongst themselves. And so when they get to Capernaum and they enter the house, and the house, by the way, belongs to Peter and Andrew. Jesus used that as his home base when he was in Capernaum. When they gathered in the house, Jesus said, "By the way, guys, what were you arguing about along the way?" And they were silent. They were silent because what they were discussing and arguing along the way was who was number one, who was the most important. In a sense, they might be saying, who's going to take over when he's gone? Now, Jesus doesn't reprimand them for saying this. He doesn't punish them for arguing. But rather, Jesus simply sits down. And we might think, well, that's nice. Maybe he was tired, and so he sat down. No. When a rabbi, and Jesus was considered a rabbi at this time, when a rabbi would sit down, his disciples would know that what was about to be said was very important, and so they better listen up. We continue to have that gesture in the church today. When the bishop or the pope wants to say something important to the diocesan church or the universal church, they sit in their cathedra at the cathedral, the bishop's chair in the cathedral, and they pronounce or teach. So Jesus sat down and began to teach the disciples what it meant to be his follower. He says, if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all. If anyone wants to be a leader, they must be willing to serve all people. If someone wants to be great in my kingdom, they need to let go of everything they hang on to in this world today. And then Jesus brings a child into their midst. Now, in the ancient world, children were seen as nobodies. They had no power, they had no influence, they were simply needy. And so they symbolized the forgotten, the vulnerable. And Jesus says, when you accept children into your life, when you care for children, the nobodies of the world today, you receive me. And when you receive me, you receive the one who sent me. It's reminiscent of what Jesus said in Matthew's gospel, whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do to me. As I was reflecting on today's gospel and wondering what I was going to preach this weekend, I thought to myself, do we in our lives act a little bit like the apostles on their journey to Capernaum? Do we at times find ourselves arguing amongst ourselves who's the most important? Who's the greatest? And I think we all do it in some way, to some extent. Over the years of being a priest and a pastor, I've talked to lots of married couples who tell me that sometimes in their life, as husband and wife, they argue. They argue quite a lot. And I said, well, what do you argue about? And they said, Father, when we look at it, it's really stupid stuff that really don't matter. But we still argue. I said, I wonder why. And the response I always get is because I want to have the last word. I want my opinion to be right and their opinion to be wrong. So we see it in married relationships. We see it between parents and children arguing with one another, who's right, who's wrong, our way or their way. We see it amongst friends, classmates. Throughout our life, we see all of us wanting to be number one, the first. I have a confession to make. I usually go golfing on Friday afternoons with a group up north in the Springdale area. And when I tee up, I do say a little prayer. And the prayer is this: Dear Lord, make my golf ball go the furthest of the group. Last Friday, it worked 3 times. I had the distance, but not the direction. So I've got to adapt my prayer this coming Friday. But we all do that. We all want to be number one. We all want to be on the top. But Jesus tells us that's not what he's all about. That's what the world tells us to do. But he says, if you want to be part of my kingdom, then you let others go first. You serve everyone who comes into your life. And you go rich in grace and mercy and love for others. Left to ourselves, we're not able to do that. Left to ourselves, we'll be just like the apostles, trying to be number one. And that's why it's important for us to be here this morning, to be nourished by God's word, to be strengthened by God's sacrament. For it's only opening ourselves to the power and grace of Jesus can you and I become the people God the Father wants us to be. People who are compassionate, people who are loving, people who are serving, especially the children of the world, not children necessarily in chronological age, that's important, but all those people who feel like they're nobody. The homeless, the poor, those suffering from addictions. We have all sorts of people all around us, and maybe sometimes in our families, who feel like they're a nobody, that no one cares, no one's concerned, no one loves them. And so today Jesus says, be that person who reaches out to them. Be that person who cares for them. Be that person who brings the love and the mercy and the grace of God into their lives.